Have you ever been absolutely certain about something, and then discovered you were completely wrong? That strange feeling of fully trusting your own perception, your memory, your interpretation of the facts, and then suddenly realizing that the story wasn't quite like that. What if I told you that, most of the time, the problem isn't a lack of information, it isn't distraction, nor a lack of intelligence, it's your brain trying to help. This happens more often than we imagine. The human brain is an impressive machine but also profoundly imperfect. It was shaped to survive, to react quickly, to make sense of the world all the time. And precisely for this reason it has a curious and dangerous habit: it hates gaps. When a story is incomplete, when pieces of information are missing, when something doesn't make immediate sense, the brain doesn't wait. It completes it. It fills in the gaps. It creates a version that seems logical, comfortable, and convincing, even if it's wrong. Have you ever experienced this? Have you ever heard only half a conversation and automatically concluded the rest? Have you ever read a headline and thought you understood everything, without realizing that your brain finished the story on its own? Or have you ever remembered an event with such clarity that you never questioned whether it really happened that way? If you've ever experienced something like this, stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you. The most intriguing thing is that when the brain completes an incorrect story, it doesn't warn you. No internal alert appears saying, "Attention, this is just an assumption." On the contrary, the feeling that arises is one of certainty, of clarity, of understanding. It's as if everything suddenly makes sense. And that's exactly where the problem lies. The brain confuses coherence with truth. If the story seems good enough, it accepts it and moves on. Within the universe of strange phenomena of the human brain, this is one of the most silent and most present in our daily lives. It influences our decisions, our judgments, our relationships, and even the way we see ourselves. The brain creates narratives all the time, and many of them don't correspond to reality. Not out of malice but out of efficiency. Thinking is hard work. Questioning requires energy. Waiting for more information is uncomfortable. So the brain chooses the shortest path, to complete the story and move on. And the most curious thing is that this happens even when we believe we are being rational. Even when we think we are calmly analyzing the facts. The brain is extremely skilled at convincing us that its conclusions are obvious, natural, and correct. That's why we so often argue with conviction, defend ideas with passion, and later realize that we started from a completely wrong interpretation. The story that seemed so clear was never complete. Perhaps you're thinking now about specific situations in your life. Moments when something didn't click, but you ignored it. Or occasions when only later, with more information, you realized that your mind had filled in blanks without asking permission. If this resonates with you, it's no coincidence. This mechanism is part of how the human brain works, and understanding it changes how we perceive our own certainties. What follows is not merely a scientific curiosity. It's a key to understanding why we err with such conviction, why we trust stories that were never entirely true, and how the brain insists on closing narratives, even when it should remain in doubt. From here, we will delve deeper into this fascinating and unsettling behavior of the human mind. And perhaps that's precisely why this topic is so unsettling. Because, at some level, we've all been deceived by a story our own brains have constructed. It's not easy to admit that. We like to believe that we see the world as it is, that we understand people as they are, that we remember the past faithfully. But the truth is that often we are simply living with well-told versions. Versions created to give us comfort, speed, and a false sense of control. As you listen to this, you might be remembering situations where something seemed too obvious, too simple, too closed off. And only later, with distance or new information, did it become clear that the story was incomplete from the beginning. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. It could be an experience, a memory, a question, or even a feeling of unease. When you share, it's not just a comment. It's a sign that you too are reflecting on how the mind works. And if, at any point during this video you thought, "This explains a lot," consider liking it. It seems simple, but this gesture tells the algorithm that this type of content needs to reach more people who also experience these silent confusions of the human mind. The more people who come here, the stronger this space becomes as a place of curiosity, questioning, and discovery. Now, if you feel that this type of conversation captivates you, provokes you, and makes you look inward, subscribing to the channel is almost a natural continuation of this journey. This channel grows exactly like that, with people who like to go beyond the surface, who aren't satisfied with easy explanations and want to understand the strange phenomena of the brain and the human body in greater depth. Your participation here is what keeps this content alive, relevant, and constantly evolving. All of this creates something bigger than a single video. It creates a community of curious, restless people willing to question their own certainties. And that matters, because the more we understand how the brain works, the more attentive we become to the stories it insists on telling. From here, things get even more interesting. Because now that you've realized how much the brain hates gaps, it's time to understand why it prefers a false story to silence, and what that reveals about how you perceive reality every day. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, starting with something so simple that it goes unnoticed almost every day. Think of a typical conversation, one of those quick ones at work, at home, or even in a text message exchange. Someone starts a sentence and, before they even finish, you already know exactly what comes next. Or at least you think you know. Your mind automatically fills it in, you agree, respond, react, and move on as if the story were complete. But often it wasn't. This happens when someone starts explaining a situation and, in the first few seconds, you feel that false clarity. I understand everything now. The rest becomes detail. The brain closes the narrative too early. It takes the beginning, cross-references it with past experiences, creates a plausible ending, and delivers the feeling of understanding. It's not conscious haste. It's an automatic shortcut. A silent backstage where the mind works without asking permission. This same mechanism appears when we read a news story. The headline grabs attention, evokes emotion, activates old beliefs, and that's it. Before even reaching the second paragraph, the story is already complete in your head. You think you understand the context, the motives, the culprits, the intentions. The brain does this because it hates ambiguity. It prefers an incomplete truth to an open question. It prefers a comfortable version to a blank space. And this doesn't just happen with external information. It also happens with memories. How many times have you told a story from the past with absolute conviction, as if you were certain of every detail, and someone said, "It wasn't quite like that"? The feeling is almost offensive because the memory seems real. But, in practice, what you accessed wasn't the original fact. It was the latest version that the brain reconstructed. An adjusted, edited version, filled in over time to make sense within your journey. The most interesting thing is to realize that this isn't directly related to distraction or lack of attention. Highly intelligent, analytical, and careful people do this all the time. Because this isn't a careless mistake. It's a structural characteristic of the human mind. The brain functions like a storyteller. It organizes the world into coherent narratives to allow for quick decisions, create emotional stability, and sustain a sense of continuity. Without this, reality would seem too chaotic. The problem arises when this ability begins to influence important decisions. Small, hasty conclusions shape larger judgments. A misinterpreted comment becomes conflict. An isolated detail becomes proof. An initial impression becomes absolute truth. And, before we know it, we are defending stories that have never been fully verified. Stories born more from the need for closure than from careful observation. There's something almost invisible in all of this. The feeling of control. When the brain completes a story, it gives the impression of mastering the situation. Now I know. Now it makes sense. This feeling is comfortable. It reduces anxiety. It avoids cognitive effort. But it also distances us from the real complexity of the facts. The truth, almost always, is more fragmented, contradictory, and slow than we would like. That's where a silent mindset shift comes in. When we begin to notice these mental shortcuts, something changes in how we handle conversations, news, memories, and even ourselves. We start to notice that impulse to finish too quickly. That moment when the mind wants to close the story before it's time. And just noticing this already changes the impact of our decisions. Because ultimately this phenomenon reveals something bigger. The human mind wasn't made to seek absolute truth. It was made to survive, interpret, and move forward. The truth often lies in the ignored details, in the pauses, in the information that hasn't yet arrived. But the brain prefers to act now rather than wait. It chooses a plausible version and moves on, even if that version carries a hidden or incomplete truth. When you start observing this in your daily life, everything takes on a new layer. Conversations become more interesting. Disagreements become less threatening. Memories begin to be seen as reconstructions, not as perfect records. It's as if you start to see behind the scenes of your own mind, realizing that not all certainty deserves immediate trust. And this doesn't mean distrusting everything or living in constant doubt. It means understanding that instant clarity isn't always a sign of deep understanding. Often it's just the brain doing what it's always done, completing stories to maintain a sense of order. This perception changes how you listen, interpret, and react. It changes the pace of your decisions. It changes the weight you give to your own conclusions. When we look closely at this mechanism, it becomes clear that it shapes our journey in subtle yet constant ways. It influences choices, relationships, beliefs, and even how we tell our own story. And the more aware we are of this, the more space we open up to question, adjust, and observe before drawing conclusions. If all of this makes sense to you, please leave a note somehow. Comment below, "That makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this is where the turning point happens that completely changes how you begin to see your own thinking. There's a central revelation behind all of this, simple in appearance but powerful in its impact. The brain hates incomplete stories. It doesn't cope well with emptiness, with pauses, with a lack of answers. Whenever something is left open, something inside us becomes restless. And this unease isn't just emotional, it's structural, it's part of how the human mind works. When information is lacking, the brain doesn't wait patiently. It doesn't sit and say, "Okay, I still don't know." On the contrary, it springs into action. It cross-references, pulls up old memories, activates known patterns, and constructs a plausible version of reality. Not because this version is true, but because it's sufficient to close the narrative. Admitting "I don't know" costs energy, generates discomfort, and creates uncertainty. Inventing something that makes sense is faster, more economical, and, curiously, more reassuring. This mechanism happens behind the scenes, outside of conscious awareness. You don't perceive the exact moment when the story is completed. What you perceive is only the final result, the feeling of understanding. It's as if a piece has fallen into place. Everything seems clear. Everything seems coherent. And it is precisely this coherence that deceives us. The brain confuses a good explanation with the correct explanation. If the narrative is fluid, it accepts it. If it eliminates doubt, it follows. This explains why so many decisions are made based on partial information. An isolated gesture becomes intention. A stray phrase becomes character. A detail becomes proof. The mind hates leaving loose ends, so it closes the circuit on its own. And, from that closure, everything else is interpreted to confirm the created story. That's how beliefs are formed. That's how judgments crystallize. That's how a hidden truth gains strength without ever having been verified. There's something almost poetic, and at the same time dangerous, about this behavior. The brain is a natural storyteller. It transforms fragments into continuous narratives to give meaning to human experience. This was essential for our survival throughout evolution. But, in today's world, this same resource can distort the perception of reality. Because not everything needs to make sense immediately. Not every story needs to be closed now. But the brain doesn't like this waiting. When you observe this closely, you realize the profound impact this mechanism has on your personal journey. It shapes how you interpret the past, project the future, and live the present. It influences the mindset with which you face challenges, relationships, and choices. Often, we are not reacting to what actually happened, but to the version that the brain has constructed to fill in the gaps. And what's most intriguing is that the more intelligent a person is, the more sophisticated the fabricated story can be. The brain uses logic, emotion, past experiences, and even seemingly rational arguments to support something born from a lack of information. This generates a powerful feeling of conviction. And conviction, as we know, is not synonymous with truth. It's merely a sign that the internal narrative is well structured. This process also explains why changing your mind is so difficult. When a story has already been closed, questioning it requires dismantling the entire structure that the brain created to maintain a sense of order. This generates resistance. It generates discomfort. It generates defensiveness. Not because the person is stubborn, but because the brain is protecting the coherence of its own narrative. Giving up an explanation, even a wrong one, means returning to the state of uncertainty that it so desperately avoids. There's a silent transformation when you start to notice this in action. You begin to notice that immediate impulse to conclude, to judge, to explain. You start to realize that often the answer comes before the question is even complete. And this simple act of noticing already creates space. Space to breathe, to observe, to postpone the closing of the story. This space changes everything. It alters decisions, reduces conflicts, and expands the ability to see beyond the first impression. The truth is that living requires dealing with incompleteness. We won't always have all the information. Stories won't always come ready-made. But the brain insists on completing them because it has been trained to do so. Recognizing this impulse doesn't mean suppressing it, but bringing it to consciousness. It means understanding that, behind many certainties, there is only an attempt to eliminate the discomfort of doubt. And the more you realize this, the more curious everything becomes. Because a silent, almost inevitable question begins to emerge. How many stories in your life were closed too soon? How many decisions were made based on plausible but incomplete narratives? How many truths did you accept simply because they seemed to make sense at that moment? This reflection doesn't lead to immediate answers, and perhaps it shouldn't. It opens up a new space, a state of more attentive observation, where you begin to see behind the scenes of your own mind. And it is precisely at this point that this subject begins to reveal even deeper layers about how the brain constructs reality, insisting on completing stories, even when silence could be more honest. If this idea resonates with you, write it in the comments. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because the way the brain does this completely changes how you interpret your own reactions. And the explanation, while powerful, is simpler than it seems. The brain wasn't designed to be precise. It was designed to function, to respond quickly, to decide before it's too late. Precision came later as a luxury, not as a priority. From very early in our history as a species, survival depended on anticipation. Those who waited for complete information often did not survive. So the brain learned to work by patterns and predictions. It observes fragments of reality and, based on past experiences, projects what is likely happening now. It is not a conscious process. It is automatic, constant, and silent. As long as you live, the brain is predicting the world's next move. These predictions aren't made because the brain wants to deceive you. They exist because predicting is more efficient than reacting. When something happens, the mind is already prepared for a response. And the faster this process, the less energy is spent. The brain consumes an enormous amount of the body's resources, even though it's a relatively small part. Saving mental energy has always been a matter of survival. Completing stories is one of those savings. Thinking deeply, analyzing scenarios, considering multiple possibilities, all of this requires effort. It requires time. It requires energy. Completing a narrative quickly is much cheaper. The brain recognizes an initial pattern, fits a plausible explanation, and delivers a feeling of understanding. Mission accomplished. The story is complete, even if reality is still full of gaps. That's why the brain prefers predictability to truth. Predictability reduces anxiety. It gives a sense of control. It creates internal stability. When something doesn't make sense, the brain goes on alert. Uncertainty generates discomfort. So it does what it knows best. It creates meaning. Even if that meaning is provisional, incomplete, or distorted. For it, that's still better than emptiness. This mechanism also explains why we are so quick to label situations and people. A behavior becomes a pattern. A mistake becomes an identity. An isolated attitude becomes character. The brain likes categories because they simplify the world. Simplifying reduces effort. It reduces doubt. It reduces the number of decisions that need to be made at any given moment. It's a survival strategy applied to a world that is now much more complex than the one for which this system was designed. There's an important detail here. The brain doesn't wait for external confirmation to validate its predictions. The internal feeling of coherence is enough. If the story seems logical, if it matches past experiences, if it fits the personal narrative you've built throughout your life, it's accepted. From that point on, new information is filtered to confirm this version. Not because you consciously chose this, but because that's how the brain works. This has a profound impact on day-to-day decisions. Small choices are made based on quick interpretations, not on thorough analyses. And most of the time this works. But when it doesn't, the mistake doesn't seem like a mistake. It just seems like what made sense at that moment. That's how false narratives gain traction. They don't emerge as lies. They emerge as predictions. Throughout life, we accumulate these predictions as if they were facts. They shape beliefs, influence attitudes, and construct how we see the world. The mind creates a continuous narrative of its own existence, connecting events, emotions, and decisions in a seemingly logical line. This narrative provides identity, purpose, and direction. But it also hides uncomfortable truths, unexplored silences, and possibilities that were never considered. When you understand that the brain operates this way, something changes in your mindset. You begin to realize that not all certainty is solid. That not every internal explanation deserves immediate trust. That many conclusions are born not from complete reality, but from the need to close a story too quickly. This realization doesn't weaken you. On the contrary, it broadens your awareness of your own mental workings. This journey of understanding isn't about distrusting everything, but about recognizing the system's limitations. The brain is incredible, but it's not impartial. It prioritizes efficiency, not accuracy. It prefers an imperfect answer now to a better answer later. And this explains why so many revelations only happen when we stop, revisit, and reevaluate old stories with more calm and more information. The more you observe this process in action, the more subtle it becomes. You begin to notice that moment when the mind wants to conclude prematurely. That impulse to say, I already know. That automatic closure that seems so comfortable. And little by little, the possibility of not closing emerges. Of leaving the story open for a little longer. Of tolerating incompleteness. This tolerance is transformative. It changes how you deal with conflict, difficult decisions, and even your own memory. It creates space for revisions, adjustments, and new interpretations. And it is in this space that many hidden truths begin to emerge. Not as ready-made answers but as better questions. All of this leads us to an even deeper layer of this phenomenon. Because when the brain completes stories to conserve energy, it doesn't just interpret the world, it shapes how you live in it. And understanding this mechanism is the first step in realizing when the mind is helping, and when it's just trying to close a story too early. If this explanation brought any new clarity, please comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because here we enter one of the most unsettling parts of this whole story. It's the moment when the brain makes a mistake, but doesn't realize it's wrong. And worse, it feels like it's right. There's a very powerful psychological point in this process, almost imperceptible, but with a huge impact on how we think, decide, and interpret reality. The feeling of certainty usually comes long before any real verification. When the brain completes a story, it doesn't just deliver an explanation. It delivers conviction. An inner certainty that seems solid, stable, indisputable. And this certainty doesn't come after analysis. It comes before. It arises as an immediate feeling of, this is obvious. This makes perfect sense. There's no other explanation. The problem is that this feeling isn't a seal of truth. It's merely a sign of familiarity. The more familiar a story seems, the more confident we become in it. If the narrative fits something we've already seen, experienced, or believed, the brain relaxes. It recognizes the pattern and reduces the level of alertness. The mind interprets this familiarity as reliability. And at that moment, doubt disappears. Not because it has been resolved, but because it has been silenced. This is one of the great behind-the-scenes aspects of human error. Error rarely presents itself as error. It doesn't arrive with warning signs, nor with a feeling of confusion. On the contrary, it arrives with clarity, with comfort, with that deceptive tranquility of someone who believes they understood everything. The error sounds like truth. It disguises itself as a logical conclusion, a mature interpretation, a correct reading of the situation. That's why we so often defend misguided ideas with such conviction. We're not consciously lying. We're simply reproducing a story that our brains closed off too early. And the more this story is repeated internally, the stronger it becomes. Each repetition increases the feeling of familiarity. And each increase in familiarity reinforces confidence. A silent cycle forms where conviction grows, even if the foundation is fragile. This mechanism directly affects our decisions. We decide quickly because we feel we already know. We choose paths because they seem obvious. We judge people because it's obvious. But this perception is often nothing more than an incomplete narrative, constructed to save mental effort. The brain prefers a plausible answer now to a more precise answer later. And when that answer seems familiar, it makes its final decision. There is something profoundly human about this. It's not weakness. It's not a lack of intelligence. It's how things work. The mind has been trained to rely on shortcuts because, for most of our history, those shortcuts worked well enough. The problem is that, in today's world, situations are more complex, more ambiguous, and less predictable. Yet, the brain continues to use old tools to deal with new challenges. When you begin to notice this pattern in action, something curious happens. You start to notice that instant when certainty arises too quickly. That moment when the mind says, I already know, even before all the information appears. And this perception generates a slight discomfort. An inner silence. Pause. It is in this space that the transformation begins. Because, contrary to what it seems, questioning one's own certainty doesn't weaken. It strengthens. It creates a more flexible, open mindset, more aware of one's own limitations. It allows for less reactive decisions and decisions more aligned with reality, even when it is confusing or incomplete. It allows one to see that many truths we hold are merely well-told stories, not confirmed facts. This process also reveals something important about identity. Many of the stories the brain completes relate to who we are, what we believe, and what we think the world is like. When these stories are questioned, we feel as if something is being threatened. It's not just an idea that wavers. It's a part of our personal narrative. That's why we resist revisions so much. That's why changing our minds hurts. But there's another side to this journey. When you accept that the brain can be wrong with conviction, you open up space for something rare: cognitive humility. The ability to say, maybe I'm wrong. The willingness to observe before concluding. The courage to hold on to doubt for a little longer. This attitude changes relationships, broadens dialogues, and reduces unnecessary conflicts. Because often the problem isn't disagreeing, it's being too certain too soon. The impact of this spreads to all levels of life. From small everyday interpretations to decisions that shape entire trajectories. When the brain believes it has gotten it right, it stops searching. It stops listening. It stops observing. It closes the story and moves on. And it is precisely in this premature closure that many hidden truths are left out. The more you allow yourself to observe this mechanism, the clearer it becomes that the feeling of certainty is not a destination. It's merely an internal state. A feeling. A sign of familiarity, not of truth. And this distinction changes everything. It alters how you react to new information, to different opinions, and even to your own memories. This perception doesn't provide ready-made answers. It raises better questions. And better questions keep us moving, attentive, curious. They prevent the mind from settling into overly closed narratives. And it is precisely in this state of observation that we begin to see something even deeper about how the brain constructs reality and how, often, it confuses conviction with truth. If this resonated with you in any way, leave a comment below. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, bringing it to concrete examples, the kind that make us stop for a second and think, wow, this happens to me all the time. Because this phenomenon doesn't just exist in the realm of ideas or scientific curiosity. It infiltrates daily life, relationships, memories, and the simplest decisions, and precisely because it seems simple, it's almost never questioned. Starting with memories. Perhaps this is one of the most delicate areas where the brain insists on completing incorrect stories. We tend to treat memory as an archive, something static, faithful, almost photographic. But the hidden truth is quite different. Memory is reconstruction. Every time you remember something, the brain doesn't access the original event. It recreates the scene from fragments, emotions, interpretations, and previous versions of that memory. And in this process, gaps are filled in without warning. This is how memories that never happened that way emerge. A tone of voice that didn't exist. An intention that was attributed later. A detail that was added years later to make the story more consistent with who you are today. The more a memory is retold, the further it moves away from the original event and closer to a comfortable narrative. The brain prefers a well-structured story to an incomplete memory. And over time, this version begins to sound like absolute truth. This has a huge impact on how we interpret the past. Old decisions begin to have explanations that make sense now, even if they didn't make sense at the time. Conflicts gain clear villains. Complex situations become simple stories. And all this happens without us realizing that we are dealing more with narrative than with fact. The brain closes the story to maintain the continuity of its own identity. Another powerful example is in how we judge people. Just one detail is enough. An out-of-place comment. A strange gesture. An interpreted silence. The brain picks up that fragment and completes the rest of the story on its own. Who that person is, what they think, what their intentions are. In a few seconds, an entire image is constructed. And the most curious thing is that, after that, everything the person does is interpreted in light of that initial narrative. If the detail was negative, each new action becomes confirmation. If it was positive, the mistakes are relativized. The brain seeks coherence, not justice. It wants the story to continue making sense. And so labels emerge that seem obvious, but which were born from very little information. Complete stories built on minimal foundations. The impact of this on relationships is enormous, because we begin to react to the story we create, not to the real person. Misinterpreted situations follow the same logic. A short message becomes coldness. A delay becomes disinterest. An okay becomes irony. The brain hates silence and ambiguity, so it fills in the gaps. And when it does, it rarely chooses the most neutral interpretation. It chooses the one most consistent with past experiences, old insecurities, or emotions activated at that moment. The story seems to make sense, so it becomes truth. This is how conflicts arise unintentionally. Not because someone wanted to hurt the other, but because two different stories were completed in parallel. Each person living within their own narrative, convinced that they perfectly understood what happened. And when these narratives clash, the clash is not just of opinions, it's of certainties. Each feels they are defending reality when in fact they are defending a version of events. These examples show how this mechanism shapes both small and large decisions. It influences career choices, relationships, moral stances, and even how we treat ourselves internally. Often, harsh self-criticism stems from incomplete narratives about who we should be, what others expect of us, and failures interpreted out of context. The brain creates a harsh narrative and begins to treat it as fact. What's most striking is realizing that, in most of these situations, there was never any ill intent. Neither from the brain nor from the people involved. There was only an attempt to quickly make sense of something incomplete. An attempt to reduce the discomfort of uncertainty. But this attempt comes at a price. The price of rigidity. The price of decisions made too soon. The price of truths that were never revisited. When you begin to observe these examples closely, something changes in your personal journey. You start to notice how many stories in your life may have been closed prematurely. How many conclusions could have been reopened. How many interpretations could have gained new layers if the silence had been tolerated for a little longer. This realization doesn't bring guilt, it brings possibility. There's a subtle transformation when we understand that not all certainty deserves eternal fidelity. That some stories may only be provisional versions. That the mind, however brilliant, operates behind the scenes trying to simplify a world that is rarely simple. And this awareness opens space for more honest revisions, more conscious decisions, and less reactive relationships. These examples are not exceptions. They are the rule. They happen every day, all the time, in small doses. And the more you see this pattern, the harder it becomes to ignore it. Because an inevitable question begins to arise. How many of the stories you carry today still deserve to be questioned? If this resonated with any point in your experience, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because up to this point everything may sound like a fascinating curiosity about how the mind works. But there's a less comfortable, and almost always invisible, side to this mechanism. The danger isn't in the brain completing stories. The danger lies in not realizing when this happens. That's when the consequences begin to accumulate silently, shaping decisions, relationships, and beliefs without us even noticing. When the brain closes a story too quickly, it doesn't just interpret reality, it decides for you. Bad decisions rarely stem from bad intentions. They arise from hasty conclusions that seemed right at the moment they were made. The mind creates a coherent narrative, delivers a sense of clarity, and thus authorizes action. But this clarity may be based on incomplete information, a partial reading, or a mistaken prediction. The impact of this appears in everyday choices. A career path abandoned too early because it wasn't for me. A relationship ended because I've already figured out who that person is. An opportunity refused because it won't work out. In all these cases, the decision seems rational, mature, conscious. But often, it was built on an incomplete story that the brain treated as the final truth. The same mechanism fuels unnecessary arguments. How many conflicts begin not because of what was said, but because of how it was interpreted? An ambiguous phrase, a misinterpreted gesture, a short answer. The brain hates ambiguity, so it fills in the gaps with intention. And almost always, the attributed intention says more about the interpreter than about the speaker. The story closes quickly, conviction arises, and the conversation ceases to be a dialogue and becomes a defense of a narrative. The problem is that when two people argue, they are rarely debating facts. They are defending internal narratives that have already been completed. Each feels they are protecting the truth, when in practice they are protecting the consistency of their own version. And the more these versions are defended, the more solid they seem. Not because they have become more correct, but because they have become more familiar. This is another invisible danger. False beliefs don't appear ready-made. They strengthen over time. Each time an incomplete story is repeated internally, it gains emotional weight. Each memory that confirms this narrative reinforces the feeling that it was always right. And little by little, what began as an assumption becomes a conviction. It becomes identity. It becomes the lens through which the world is interpreted. This process is slow and silent. It doesn't generate alarm. It doesn't cause immediate shock. On the contrary, it brings comfort. Because living within closed narratives is simpler than sustaining open doubts. The brain prefers stability to complexity. And this preference shapes entire mindsets. People spend years trapped in beliefs that have never truly been questioned, only reinforced by the habit of repeating the same narrative. There is a profound impact in all of this. When a false belief takes hold, it begins to filter reality. Contrary information is ignored, minimized, or reinterpreted. Data that challenges the narrative causes discomfort. The brain enters narrative protection mode. Not because it is true but because it maintains a sense of order. And, at that point, the search for truth gives way to the search for internal coherence. This is one of the most important behind-the-scenes aspects of the human mind. We are not only deceived by external information, but by the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the world. And these stories directly influence each person's personal journey. They shape expectations, justify choices, and explain failures or successes in ways that don't always correspond to the facts. The invisible danger isn't in making mistakes. Making mistakes is part of the process. The danger lies in making mistakes with such conviction that the error ceases to be questionable. When the brain believes it's right, it stops observing. It stops listening. It stops learning. And it's at this point that growth stalls, because transformation requires space for revision. But none of this means living in constant insecurity or distrust. On the contrary, it means developing a more conscious mindset about one's own limitations. Understanding that not every certainty deserves immediate action. That some stories need more time. That some interpretations deserve a pause before becoming a decision. This awareness changes the impact of choices. It reduces conflicts that never needed to exist. It weakens rigid beliefs that were only sustained by habit. It creates a more open attitude towards reality, more curious and less defensive. And this doesn't make life more confusing, it makes it more honest. When you notice this mechanism at work, a silent question begins to emerge in various everyday situations. Did I close this chapter too soon? This question doesn't provide an immediate answer, but it opens up space. And space is exactly what the brain normally avoids. It is in this space that new revelations can arise. Because ultimately the greatest risk isn't not knowing. The greatest risk is thinking you know, too soon. And recognizing this isn't weakness. It's cognitive maturity. It's the beginning of a more conscious relationship with your own thoughts, decisions, and internal narratives. If this reflection resonated with you, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because after understanding how the brain completes incorrect stories, a silent question almost automatically arises. Is it possible to deceive the brain less? Is it possible to reduce this impulse to close narratives too early, to decide too quickly, to transform assumptions into internal truths? The honest answer is, it's not possible to turn off this mechanism, but it is possible to deal with it in a much more conscious way. The first point, and perhaps the most transformative, is the pause. It seems too simple to be relevant, but it's not. Pausing before concluding creates a small interval between the impulse and the decision. It is in this interval that something powerful happens. The brain works automatically because it almost never encounters resistance. When you pause, even for just a few seconds, you break the flow of the automatic narrative. The story still wants to conclude, but now there is a space where it doesn't rule alone. This pause doesn't need to be dramatic or visible to others. It's internal. It's that moment when you realize certainty is emerging too quickly and decide not to act on it immediately. This gesture changes the impact of decisions. Not because you suddenly have all the answers, but because you stop treating the first interpretation as definitive. The second key lies in questioning this first interpretation. Not in a paranoid way but with curiosity. The question isn't, is this wrong? But, is this the only possible interpretation? The brain tends to cling to the first story because it comes with relief. Questioning it reintroduces discomfort. But it is precisely this discomfort that broadens perception. It opens up space for other versions, other contexts, other possibilities that were invisible when the narrative was closed too quickly. When you question the initial interpretation, something interesting happens behind the scenes in your mind. The brain switches from confirmation mode and enters, even if briefly, exploration mode. It begins to look for alternatives. And that changes everything. Because, at that moment, you stop being just a spectator of internal narratives and become an active observer of your own thinking. The third question is perhaps the most powerful of all, precisely because it is simple and disconcerting. What don't I know yet? This question dismantles the false sense of completeness. It reminds the brain that the story may be incomplete. And curiously, it doesn't demand an immediate answer. Its value lies not in answering, but in opening space for incompleteness to exist without being forcibly filled. This question changes the mindset. It shifts the focus from certainty to curiosity. And curiosity is a very different mental state from conviction. While conviction closes things off, curiosity keeps things open. While conviction ends the journey, curiosity extends the path. And it is in this extension that adjustments, corrections, and more honest revelations emerge. Applying this to daily life doesn't mean living in constant doubt. It means recognizing that many decisions don't need to be instantaneous. That some stories gain depth when they aren't resolved in the first act. That not all immediate clarity is a sign of real understanding. This understanding changes how you react in conversations, interpret messages, revisit memories, and deal with conflicts. This has a direct impact on relationships. When you pause and question the initial interpretation, conflicts lose strength before they even arise. Many arguments cease to exist because the initial story is not treated as a fait accompli. The misinterpreted phrase gains context. The strange gesture gains other possible explanations. And, instead of reacting to the created narrative, you react to reality with more space and less rigidity. In the realm of decision-making, the effect is even more profound. Pausing before concluding changes the rhythm of the journey. Decisions cease to be automatic responses and become more conscious choices. This doesn't guarantee you'll always be right, but it drastically reduces the risk of decisions based solely on comfortable assumptions. It reduces the impact of regrets that arise from stories closed too soon. There is also a silent transformation in how you see yourself. Many internal narratives, about failure, inadequacy, limitations, are incomplete stories that have been repeating themselves for years. When you begin to apply these questions to yourself, something shifts. Self-criticism loses its power. Hard-won certainties about who you are begin to show cracks. And in these cracks emerge broader, more human, and truer versions of your own identity. None of this requires perfection. The brain will continue to complete stories. That doesn't change. What changes is the relationship you establish with those stories. They cease to be orders and become suggestions. They cease to be absolute truths and become hypotheses. And this change in attitude is one of the most profound forms of mental maturation that exist. The more you practice this pause, this questioning, and this open-ended questioning, the easier it becomes to recognize when the brain is simply trying to conserve energy. You begin to see the inner workings of thought in real time. And this doesn't make life heavier, it makes it more conscious, more honest, more aligned with the true complexity of the human experience. This process doesn't close anything. On the contrary, it opens things up. It opens space for new interpretations, new decisions, and new ways of relating to one's own mind. And it is precisely from this space that understanding the brain ceases to be merely information and begins to transform into a practical tool for everyday life. If this part of the conversation changed your perspective in any way, leave a comment below. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because after everything that has been said so far, a different kind of inner silence begins to emerge. It's no longer that uncomfortable silence of initial doubt, but a more attentive, almost observant silence. It's the moment when we realize that we are not only learning something new about the brain, but also rethinking how we have always related to it. Throughout this conversation, it became clear that the brain is not a neutral judge of reality. It doesn't sit coldly analyzing facts, waiting for definitive proof before deciding. It's in constant motion, trying to maintain coherence, continuity, and meaning. It wants to close cycles, conclude stories, reduce the effort of existing in a world that is constantly changing. And that says a lot about us. There's a subtle revelation here, one that often goes unnoticed. Much of our inner security doesn't come from truth, but from narrative. We feel more at ease when things make sense, even if that sense is hastily constructed. The mind prefers an imperfect explanation to an honest void. It prefers a plausible version to an open question. And that's not a flaw, it's a strategy. But every strategy has a cost. When the mind gets used to prioritizing well-structured narratives, it begins to confuse clarity with depth. It starts treating familiarity as evidence. It begins to defend internal versions more strongly than the facts themselves. And little by little, without realizing it, we begin to live inside the stories we tell ourselves. This is where the central phrase of this video begins to gain real weight, not as a dramatic effect, but as an uncomfortable mirror. The brain doesn't seek the truth. It seeks a good story even if it's wrong. This phrase doesn't accuse. It reveals. It doesn't diminish the human mind but shows its internal logic. The brain wants continuity. It wants predictability. It wants a narrative line that connects past, present, and future in a minimally stable way. The impact of this on one's personal journey is enormous. How many choices were made not because they were the best, but because they fit well with the story you believed about yourself? How many decisions were justified later, adjusting the narrative to make everything seem coherent? How many times was the truth softened, edited, or ignored so that the story would continue to work? When we look at this honestly, something changes in our mindset. Not because we start doubting everything, but because we begin to respect the complexity of the human experience more. We realize that living isn't about solving everything, understanding everything, closing everything off. Living is often about sustaining open stories. It's about walking without a defined end. It's about accepting that some truths only appear when the mind stops trying to fit everything together too quickly. There is a silent transformation when you begin to recognize this pattern within yourself. The rush diminishes. Reactivity weakens. Certainties become less rigid. And curiously, life doesn't become more confusing. It becomes richer. More real. More aligned with what truly happens behind the scenes of the mind. This understanding doesn't end the matter. It opens a door. Because, from here, an inevitable curiosity arises about how many other parts of our perception are shaped by this same narrative impulse. How many experiences are filtered, adjusted, or reinterpreted to fit into a good story? How many revelations are still hidden behind the need for immediate meaning? When you begin to observe your own thinking with this perspective, you realize that many certainties lose their weight as absolute truths and take on the form of hypotheses. And this is not a loss, it's freedom. Freedom to revise, to update, to grow. Freedom not to be a prisoner of old stories that no longer explain who you are today. This attitude changes how you relate to the world. Conversations become more open. Differences become less threatening. Decisions become more conscious and less automatic. And, most importantly, you begin to realize when your brain is just trying to protect the narrative, and when it's worth leaving the story open for a little longer. None of this requires you to abandon your sense of direction. It only requires you to recognize that not every story needs an immediate ending. Some need space. Some need silence. Some need to be retold in a different light. And that space is precisely where perception deepens. This final sentence doesn't close the topic. It resonates. Because, from the moment you understand that the brain seeks stories before seeking the truth, a new curiosity arises about what else it does to maintain this sense of continuity. And that's where other layers of this functioning begin to reveal themselves, in an even more intriguing way. If this thought has resonated with you, leave a comment below. That makes sense to me. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this conversation has stayed with you from beginning to end. Perhaps an idea, perhaps a feeling of unease, perhaps that silent sensation of, this explains a lot. When content manages to provoke this kind of reflection, it's worth continuing to explore. That's why subscribing to the channel is a simple way to keep this space alive. A place where curiosity about the human mind doesn't end with easy answers, but continues with better questions. If you want, leave a comment saying, I'm with you until the end. It's not just about showing up, it's about demonstrating that this message reached the other side and made sense on some level. These comments help create a real exchange, and it's from this exchange that future videos are born. And if at any point you felt connected to this conversation, a like already says a lot. It's a small gesture, but it signals that this type of content deserves to continue appearing and reaching other people who also like to go beyond the surface. There's a video over here that complements this topic and delves even deeper into these ideas about how the brain constructs reality. Click there and continue reading.